I've talked before in these videos extensively, I think, about the relationships between concepts and percepts, and how ideas drawn from embodied cognition, conceptual metaphor theory, cognitive linguistics, those kind of disciplines, experiential philosophy, those kind of disciplines tend to suggest that our ability to consciously conceive of something, or indeed non-consciously conceive of something, is driven by our ability to perceive something. So the structure of our concepts tends to mirror the structure of our percepts. And as I say, that could be non-conscious or conscious. And certainly the work of a lot of cognitive linguistics works, particularly Lakoff and Johnson, but others as well, draws on the use of terms like metaphor to explain that relationship between percepts and concepts. So the perceptual experience of travelling down a road, starting from an origin, going down a particular path and arriving at a particular goal at the other end of it, is a perceptual sequence, experiential sequence, involving completely embodied, sensorially available percepts. That structure, that experience, that provides a framework for conceptual ideas, which similarly have a kind of source, path, goal structure to them, and various entailments attach themselves to that as inferences on that structure. So, for example, we talk about courses of education, or we talk about kind of life experiences as if they were journeys with sources, paths, and goals. That's just one example, but the general idea of that is that abstract concepts take their form from concrete percepts. So where am I going with that? Oh yeah, I was just thinking about that in relation to the self concept. What it means to have this thing called a self, or to be this thing called a self, or to understand what a self might be when we talk about it. I just got to show this guy, my dog's got his nose down a very deep burrow. Anyway, what it means to have a self-concept. A lot of concepts of the self, as they're written about in various psychological literature, or whatever kind of literature. An example of this might be Ken Wilber's integral work. I don't have a lot of interest in where Ken Wilber takes these ideas, but I think he does a good job of kind of looking at the traditions and reviewing various traditions of what the self-concept might be in the broadest and the narrowest sense. And what comes out of that is that the self-concept has some kind of structure. It's multifaceted, it seems to be multi-layered, there's lots of parts to it. And you find that, I think, in all those models, although the parts may be laid out differently, there are some correspondences across the various ideas. So what that seems to suggest to me is there's a relatively consistent set of understandings about what a self is. It's an abstract concept. So what are the concrete perceptual frameworks and structures that abstract concept is mapping itself from? And really I'm just trying to pull together some other stuff I've talked about here. I think it must be drawn from embodied experience, and some of that embodied experience will be completely felt and be reportable and conscious, and some of it will be either not felt at all and not reportable and not conscious, or only felt and experienced and reported upon with a great deal of effort. But it seems to me there are various components of that. So, for example, what I've mentioned before is Thomas Metzinger's work on what might call a core self, or a sense of a stable self, which he attributes to the stable embodied experiences, if that's the right word, the stable and consistent signals, if you like, that the biochemistry of the body is sending up to the brain. So there's like a regular kind of biochemical pulse there, if you like, which is consistent. and stable, and which for Metzinger provides the framework for a stable consciousness and a stable sense of identity. But either way, that seems to be part of it. It is our perceptual set, albeit highly non-conscious, is this kind of stable backbeat. That's one part of it. Then there'd be a part of it which is, and I'm just talking again in perceptual terms here, in sensory terms, is this proprioceptive sense of the body, which is an odd one. It's not spatialized in the way that other exterior senses are. It's I don't know how to describe it really, but it's a kind of non-spatial sense of, it's dynamic, it's moving. I know where my arms are without looking. I know where my legs are without looking where they are. So it has a kind of internal awareness, but it's not really spatialized. My legs don't feel as if they're below my arms. I mean, I know they are, but I kind of have to consciously know that, or consciously look down. There's not a sense in my body that, you know, my legs are differently placed to my arms in relation to some kind of understanding of self. They're all me. So there's a different kind of bodily awareness there. And then there's the various sensory awarenesses, which, in terms of space, but in terms of how they operate, have different kinds of functions. The sense of taste is very internal, very personal, as opposed to senses like hearing, which is experienced more externally, and vision, which is extremely external, and which seems to kind of flow out into the world. So these different senses seem to have different kind of form different conceptual components, perceptual components. A stable core biochemical self, if you like, element to self, a less stable but non-spatialized proprioceptive sense of self, and then a range of what you might think of as concentric centers of knowledge gathering information from various different sensory modes. I think those taken together, all of those different levels of engagement and actions and processes, could be seen to be potentially components for a kind of understanding of self, if they were taken into the metaphorical realm, or if we're to use those as the basis for a kind of metaphorical mapping. And for reasons that I've spoken out before, if I was going to take those different components and arrange them in a diagram in space, I would arrange them in terms of concentric circles. I don't really want to explain why again. I've done that before several times. I'm pretty well rehearsed on that bit. But the center of the circle would be this kind of biochemical pulse. Then there'll be close up to that, there will be a circle representing proprioception. Outside of that would be those other kinds of sensory engagements, but probably oriented with taste, and then the other senses arrayed around that, and other concentric circles, with sight being and vision being perhaps the outermost circle, because that seems to have the greatest level of exteriority and reach and variance in it. I mean, I think it's interesting that idea of concentric circles is one you find in Ken Wilber, which I've mentioned. He does this weird thing where he puts Cartesian coordinates across the middle of it, which has some value as well, I think. But in terms of what I'm talking about right now, that's that image of a kind of target, a series of concentric circles around a kind of dimensionless point in the center is quite interesting. I think it's also interesting that you find it in Jung, who I haven't read as much as I'd like to of, but I know he uses that and talks about it in relation to mandalas. He has this thing where he thinks mandalas that you find in non-Western cultures are kind of archetypal models of the psyche. And he might have a point, I don't know. But certainly in terms of the way I'm thinking about it, I think there's a kind of naturalistic account to understand why that kind of mandala form, that series of concentric circles, might make sense as a model of the psyche, if we think of the psyche and the self as I say, these components, drawn entirely from biochemical and embodied processes, translated across into a kind of metaphorical realm. So instead of thinking of ourselves in terms of biochemistry and sensory engagement, we're thinking of ourselves in terms of core self and kind of animus, whatever the Jungian terms might be beyond that. But as that kind of a being, I don't think I've really got to where I wanted to be with that video. No more.